Winter in medieval Europe was not just cold, it was a force that could erase lives quietly, invisibly, and with terrifying efficiency. Imagine a village buried under 3 feet of snow, smoke rising from chimneys that barely heated the air, livestock huddled in stables, and peasants scraping frost off their windows at dawn. For most people, surviving from November to March was not a given, it was a battle waged day by day, meal by meal, fire by fire. The medieval calendar itself seemed designed to remind people of the harshness of winter. Saints' feast days, Candlemas, Christmas, and the vague promises of spring were punctuated by hunger, disease, and relentless cold. The diet of ordinary peasants was pitiful: root vegetables that could survive underground through winter, preserved grains, and whatever meat or fish could be salted or smoked. Any failure in preparation meant famine, a brutal companion that would lurk in shadows while temperatures dropped to life-threatening lows. One shocking truth is that most medieval people didn't live past their 40s, and winter was a major contributor. Studies of skeletons from English villages reveal stunted growth and nutritional deficiencies that peaked after the coldest months. The poorest houses, if you could even call them that, were little more than one-room hovels made of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs, dirt floors, and smoke-choked interiors. Heating came from a single hearth, usually in the center, and even there, the warmth barely reached the corners. And yet, medieval people had ingenious ways of surviving what we would now call a nightmare scenario. In some regions, villagers would construct hypocaust-style floors beneath their homes to circulate heat from communal ovens. Others buried their roots and stored grain in straw-lined pits to prevent freezing. A curious method, almost laughable to modern eyes, involved layering beds with multiple straw mattresses, animal hides, and even fresh pine branches to trap heat. There are accounts from 14th century England of entire families huddling together in one bed to preserve warmth, a method both intimate and terrifying in its necessity. Food scarcity was one of the most horrifying aspects. In extreme winters, villagers ate tree bark, boiled acorns, or lichens scraped from rocks. Some wealthy households attempted to store meats in ice pits, a technique remarkably advanced for its time, but the poor had nothing but their ingenuity. Villagers would feed themselves with dried fish, salted meat, and soups made from boiled turnips, onions, and leeks. It was bland, repetitive, and often insufficient, leading to rampant scurvy, frostbite, and, in some cases, death before spring arrived. Diseases thrived in winter. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and influenza spread like wildfire through crowded homes. Sanitation was minimal, and the cold prevented effective bathing. The poor, weakened by hunger, often succumbed to infections that a healthy adult might have survived in warmer months. Hospitals were rare, and monasteries, the primary centers of medieval medical knowledge, could provide only rudimentary care. Despite all this, medieval winters were also times of cunning survival strategies. Communities shared resources, grain, firewood, and even clothing. Some villages had communal barns where livestock could be rotated to prevent freezing, and neighbors would help each other repair roofs, chimneys, or wells. Snow itself could be a resource, used to insulate floors, cool meat stores, or even filter water. Interestingly, some medieval people had habits that modern audiences might find shocking. Wealthy Europeans sometimes relied on exotic imported spices, not for taste, but because they believed certain spices kept the body warm or warded off disease. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and pepper weren't just culinary, They were considered life-saving tools in bitter winters. Meanwhile, peasants might resort to burning bones, leather scraps, or even their own furniture to maintain heat when firewood ran out. The psychological toll was immense. Chronic fear of starvation, the sound of wind through cracks in the walls, and the sight of neighbors freezing or dying created a communal anxiety that shaped medieval culture. Folklore, songs, and festivals were all adapted to help people cope with the terrifying reality of winter, masking fear with humor, superstition, and ritual. By spring, surviving the winter was celebrated with feasts and ceremonies, but the scars remained. Skeletons tell stories of fractured limbs, teeth worn down from grinding bark, and chronic illnesses. Yet those who survived had learned resilience, ingenuity, and the value of community. The winter was an enemy, but humanity endured, often at staggering cost. Winter's grip tightened as the year progressed. By December, frost had encased villages in a sparkling but lethal shell. Rivers froze solid, cutting off vital transport for goods and food. Villagers who relied on fish suddenly faced empty nets. Horses and oxen, essential for plowing and transport, often froze to death or succumbed to starvation. The loss of even a few beasts could spell economic and physical disaster for an entire community. In Northern Europe, people developed bizarre but effective strategies to survive long, dark nights. In Scandinavia, some households dug sod houses partially into the ground. These homes, layered with earth and turf, insulated families against temperatures that could drop below -20 degrees Celsius -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The interiors were dark, damp, and smoky, but warmth was concentrated near the hearth, and the earth walls retained heat long after the fire died. Families often slept together, bundled under layers of wool and animal pelts, while infants and elderly were kept closest to the fire. Food scarcity remained the most critical challenge. During long winters, medieval people practiced extreme rationing. A loaf of bread might last several days, even a small piece of smoked meat was eaten slowly and sparingly. Hunger forced creative, sometimes horrifying solutions. In 14th century England, records mention families scraping fat from candles to cook meals, boiling fish heads, or eating boiled weeds when grain and root vegetables ran out. Famine diets led to widespread malnutrition, with scurvy and beriberi silently killing hundreds each winter. But survival was not just about food, it was about ingenuity. Medieval people mastered preservation techniques that seem miraculous today. Salted and smoked meats, pickled vegetables, and dried fruits were lifelines. Wealthy households experimented with ice storage. Large pits lined with straw and packed with ice could preserve meat for weeks. The poor, lacking ice or salt, relied on simple drying techniques, sun-drying herbs and grains in autumn for winter use. Even snow could serve as insulation for stored goods, keeping potatoes, turnips, and carrots from freezing solid. Fire, the eternal lifeline, required constant vigilance. Fuel was scarce, and the cold demanded endless burning. Villagers scavenged branches, brush, and even discarded wooden tools to maintain warmth. Wealthy landowners hoarded firewood like treasure, while peasants often faced the grim choice of cold or starvation. Smoke from smoky, underventilated fires caused chronic respiratory issues, a problem amplified in the already fragile bodies of the malnourished. Medieval winters were not just physically dangerous, they were psychologically punishing. The long nights, stretching 14 to 16 hours in northern latitudes, fostered despair. Seasonal depression, though unnamed, was real. Communities attempted to counteract the darkness with festivals, music, and storytelling. Yule traditions, candlelit feasts, and songs were not mere entertainment, they were survival tools. Keeping spirits from collapsing under the weight of isolation and hunger. The era's medicine, or what passed for it, was intertwined with winter survival. Monks and apothecaries distributed herbal remedies, ginger, garlic, thyme, to treat frostbite, coughs, and fever. Yet many remedies were more superstition than science, placing live frogs on the soles of frozen feet, drinking water from snow-covered wells at midnight, or burning incense to ward off the evil cold were all common practices. Miraculously, some of these folk techniques had measurable effects, like warming the body or disinfecting small wounds, though they often fell short against disease. Children were the most vulnerable during winter. Records from plague and famine years describe staggering child mortality. The combination of cold, hunger, and disease meant that many children never saw spring. Those who survived learned survival skills early, layering clothing, tending fires, and rationing food became instinctual behaviors. Stories of young girls walking miles to fetch firewood through snowstorms are common in medieval chronicles, revealing resilience that modern readers find almost unbelievable. The aristocracy faced different, but still severe, challenges. Castles, while better insulated than peasant hovels, had massive stone walls that absorbed cold. Even with tapestries, central fireplaces, and heavy furs, warmth was limited. Servants endured long nights carrying firewood, tending animals, and delivering food. Feasts continued, but the larders and wine stores were carefully monitored. A failed shipment of salted fish or winter wheat could spark panic. Winter warfare added another dimension of danger. Armies could freeze before they even reached the battlefield. Historical records from the Hundred Years' War describe soldiers huddled in trenches, boots frozen solid, unable to march. In some cases, frostbite claimed more lives than sword or arrow. Even in peacetime, preparation, resourcefulness, and communal solidarity can turn even the deadliest season into a challenge worth facing. By the late 14th century, Europe had entered a period historians now call the Little Ice Age. Winters grew longer, colder, and more unpredictable. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already demonstrated how fragile survival was. Excess rain, failed crops, and early snow had starved nearly a third of the population in some regions. But the bitter decades that followed brought winters that seemed designed to punish humanity. In Russia and Scandinavia, winter lasted half the year. Rivers and lakes froze solid, isolating communities from trade and leaving them dependent entirely on what they could store or forage. Some villages built ingenious insulated barns for livestock, often burrowing them into hillsides and layering the roofs with straw, turf, and snow. Animals, like humans, were survival investments. A frozen cow or pig could mean the difference between life and death. Italy and southern Europe, though milder, were not immune to extreme cold. Northern Italian cities like Florence and Milan occasionally experienced rivers frozen over so solidly that merchants set up temporary ice markets. Records from 1450 describe gondolas trapped in Venice's canals by ice so thick that people could walk across them. These events, while spectacular, were dangerous. Anyone who slipped through the ice risked instant death. The deadliest winters left tangible evidence in historical archives. In 1709, Europe experienced what has been called the Great Frost. Temperatures lunged below -20 degrees Celsius -4 degrees Fahrenheit across France, Germany, and Italy. Rivers froze, crops perished, and livestock died en masse. Contemporary accounts describe people boiling tree bark, eating roots, and burning furniture for warmth. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands perished, not from violence, but from cold, hunger, and disease. Medieval diaries and letters provide a chilling window into daily life during such winters. One 14th-century English villager wrote of walking 3 miles to fetch firewood through thigh-deep snow, returning home to find her house almost uninhabitable and the family starving. A French monk recorded witnessing entire villages abandoned because the inhabitants had perished or fled to survive. In these personal stories, survival wasn't heroic, it was a matter of luck, resourcefulness, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. Survival strategies varied widely by region and class. In the Alps, villagers constructed snow shelters, small, partially subterranean rooms insulated with layers of straw and timber. Families would huddle inside, the youngest and oldest nearest the hearth. In Scandinavia, it was common to store hay and straw not just for livestock, but as emergency bedding for humans. Every ounce of insulation counted. Some peasants even slept with animals in the same room, believing that shared body heat could ward off hypothermia. Medieval diets in winter were astonishingly monotonous yet clever. Soups made from turnips, onions, beans, and whatever meat was available provided calories and warmth. In northern regions, fish, fresh or salted, was critical. In England, the tradition of eating pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, helped people stretch small quantities of food. Honey, when available, was a luxury and a valuable source of calories. And for the truly desperate, acorns, tree bark, and lichens were eaten, often boiled into mush to make them digestible. Medicinal practices adapted to the harsh climate in intriguing ways. Monks and apothecaries prepared concoctions from herbs such as thyme, sage, and juniper to ward off respiratory illnesses and frostbite. Hot baths were rare and reserved for the wealthy, but heat from steaming herbs or hot stones provided localized relief. Some remedies were highly symbolic. Intended more to comfort the patient psychologically, burning incense, chanting prayers, and ritualized warming techniques were considered life-saving in their own right. Even ordinary tools were adapted for survival. Iron pots were used not only for cooking but for heating rooms when filled with hot stones. Furs and textiles were layered meticulously, wool was prized above all, followed by linen, fur, and even feathers. Some peasants cut open straw mattresses to line clothing, boots, and bedding. Every inch of insulation was calculated with precision. The psychological resilience required to survive these winters cannot be overstated. Children learned early to endure hunger and cold, and adults developed mental strategies to cope with fear. Storytelling, music, and religious observances became survival mechanisms. The bleak midwinter was filled with superstition, witches, spirits, and demons were blamed for extreme cold, and rituals to appease them were widespread. These beliefs, while often irrational, gave people a sense of agency in a world that could otherwise crush them. Winter shaped medieval culture profoundly. Feasts at Candlemas, Yule, and Easter were not mere celebrations, they were ritualized acts of survival, reinforcing community solidarity and morale. Songs, legends, and fairy tales often featured winter as a lethal force, teaching lessons about preparation, courage, and ingenuity. It was a world where the line between life and death was defined not by sword or war, but by snow, frost, and the ability to endure. And yet, against all odds, people survived. They built homes that trapped warmth, stored food with remarkable foresight, and developed clothing, diets, and medical practices designed to counter the merciless cold. Communities relied on each other, sharing resources and knowledge. They created rituals, legends, and traditions that celebrated endurance as much as survival. Medieval winters were brutal, deadly, and often incomprehensible to modern audiences. But they were also a testament to human ingenuity. The cold shaped minds and bodies, forged resilience, and forced creativity on a scale we can hardly imagine today. Most people did not survive, but those who did passed down lessons that would echo for centuries, reminders that even in the harshest conditions, humans adapt, endure, and, occasionally, triumph. The medieval winter was not merely a season, it was an omnipresent threat, capable of bringing entire regions to their knees. Extreme winters produced disasters that still shock historians today. In 1362, the Grootmandrank storm swept across the North Sea, flooding coastlines and freezing marshlands. Thousands perished in the floodwaters and freezing mud. Families that survived found their homes buried, crops destroyed, and livestock drowned, forcing desperate migrations inland. Such winters were punctuated by famine, disease, and mass mortality, a grim reminder that nature, not war or politics, ruled the lives of ordinary people. In 1315 to 1317, Europe endured the Great Famine, a prolonged period of crop failure exacerbated by relentless cold and rainfall. Entire villages reported people eating horses, dogs, cats, and even roots and bark to stave off starvation. Monasteries kept meticulous records, documenting bodies piling up in churchyards, children dying by the dozen, and the elderly succumbing silently in their homes. For those who survived, winter became an annual gauntlet of preparation and dread, where luck was as crucial as skill. Castles, often romanticized as bastions of comfort, were surprisingly harsh in winter. The massive stone walls that kept invaders out also absorbed and radiated cold. Heating came from fireplaces that barely reached upper chambers. Nobles relied on furs, tapestries, and thick bedding, but servants often endured sub-zero nights in drafty corridors, fetching water and firewood, tending livestock, and delivering meals. Even royal kitchens were vulnerable. A failed ice harvest or spoiled grain could compromise months of preparation, leaving a castle's inhabitants dangerously undernourished. In contrast, peasant homes were even more vulnerable, yet sometimes surprisingly clever. Subterranean storage pits, sod or timbered walls, and communal sleeping arrangements maximized warmth with minimal resources. Every piece of clothing, every layer of straw, every animal pelt was critical. The poorest families often shared beds with livestock, a survival strategy that seems shocking to modern eyes but was often the difference between life and death. Winter survival was also a story of ingenuity with food. Salted and smoked meats were essential. Porridges, stews, and pottages were stretched to feed large families. In Scandinavia, fermented fish, known as surströmming, allowed people to store protein for months. In England and France, root vegetables such as turnips, parsnips, and cabbage became winter staples, often boiled repeatedly to extract calories. For the desperate, acorns, lichens, and tree bark were boiled into edible mush, a grim but effective measure against starvation. Medieval medicine was deeply intertwined with survival. Herbal remedies, steaming herbs, and hot poultices were used to treat frostbite, coughs, and fevers. Some remedies were symbolic, intended to restore hope rather than cure illness. For example, villagers might carry heated stones in their pockets or sprinkle salt across doorways to protect against winter demons. These practices, blending superstition and necessity, reveal how psychological resilience was as vital as physical survival. Folklore and ritual were woven tightly into the fabric of winter survival. Yule traditions, Candlemas celebrations, and St. Lucia festivals were more than festive, they reinforced community bonds and provided mental sustenance. Stories of winter spirits, snow witches, and frost giants served as cautionary tales, warning villagers to prepare, ration, and respect the cold. In a world where a single blizzard could wipe out a family, caution was a virtue, and superstition was survival. Personal accounts from medieval diaries and letters bring the terror and ingenuity of winter vividly to life. One 15th-century Flemish merchant wrote of being trapped in his home for 3 weeks with his family, subsisting on dried fish and stale bread while snow piled against their windows. In northern England, a chronicler recounted villagers huddling in a church overnight during a blizzard, holding animals and children close for warmth. These stories reveal not only human endurance but also the ever-present threat of death, lurking outside the door. Survival often depended on resourcefulness. Villagers repaired roofs to prevent collapse under heavy snow, dug channels to prevent flooding from melting ice, and constantly tended their fires. Even mundane objects took on extraordinary value. Iron pots were used to heat rooms, straw mattresses were cut into layers for clothing, and the smallest scraps of wool were sewn into extra garments. Every detail mattered. As the harshest months wore on, the psychological toll grew. Hunger, illness, and isolation contributed to a sense of despair. Yet communities endured by maintaining routines, sharing resources, and relying on stories and songs. The winter forged resilience, a mental toughness that shaped entire generations. Those who survived carried the scars, visible and invisible, but also the knowledge and ingenuity needed to face the next season. Finally, the thaw brought relief and celebration, but it also revealed the cost of winter. Skeletons unearthed centuries later tell stories of stunted growth, broken bones, and chronic disease. Villages recorded missing family members, livestock lost, and barns emptied of supplies. Yet in surviving, medieval people demonstrated astonishing creativity, courage, and endurance. Their struggle against winter was brutal, often silent, and mostly forgotten, but it shaped a world where every spring was a victory, every harvest a miracle, and every warm meal an achievement hard-earned. Some winters were so severe that survival became legendary. The winter of 1435 in northern Europe, for example, earned a fearsome reputation. Chroniclers wrote of rivers and canals frozen solid for months, fields buried under snow, and livestock dying in unprecedented numbers. Villagers scavenged forests for anything edible, tree bark, acorns, and even moss. In one record from Germany, a small village lost nearly half its population simply because the frozen soil prevented planting, the snow blocked access to markets, and their grain stores were ruined by damp and mold. In Scandinavia, extreme winters forced communities to develop highly specialized survival techniques. People dug subterranean storage cellars and insulated them with layers of earth, straw, and animal hides. Families would rotate fire-warmed stones under beds to maintain a minimum warmth at night. Ice fishing became a vital source of protein, but it was perilous. Men risked falling into frozen rivers and lakes, often freezing before help could arrive. Even clothing was engineered for survival. Multiple layers of wool, linen, and fur were sewn together, sometimes supplemented with feathers or straw, to trap body heat as effectively as possible. In the Alps, communities adapted to snowbound life with ingenuity that borders on genius. Entire villages developed snow tunnels and covered passageways between homes to reduce exposure. Roofs were steeply pitched to prevent collapse under heavy snowfall, and massive communal ovens heated not just bread but the surrounding air of shared spaces. Alpine farmers sometimes fed their livestock hay layered with straw and animal dung to maintain body heat, ensuring at least minimal protein production through the cold months. Southern Europe faced milder winters, but survival was still challenging. Venice, often romanticized for its canals and gondolas, suffered from frozen waterways during rare but severe cold spells. Trade halted, salt and fish became scarce, and merchants scrambled to maintain food supplies. Even the wealthy, insulated by stone palaces and extensive stores, were vulnerable. Ice-blocked wells, spoiled wine, and frozen fish threatened both comfort and nutrition. One of the most astonishing aspects of medieval winter survival was the ingenuity applied to food preservation. Beyond salting, smoking, and drying, communities experimented with fermentation. Scandinavian surströmming and German sauerkraut are famous examples, foods that could sustain a population through months when nothing else was available. Some households boiled roots and grains repeatedly to make them digestible and calorie-dense. Wild plants, previously ignored, were studied and harvested to supplement diets, a practice that saved countless lives. Medicine, though primitive, was adapted to extreme cold. Frostbite treatments involved warming affected limbs slowly, often with heated herbs, stones, or even animal bladders filled with hot water. Respiratory illnesses were treated with steam from boiling herbs, while fevers were often managed with diet and herbal tonics. Many remedies combined superstition with science. Amulets, prayers, and rituals were as common as poultices and herbal concoctions, reflecting a holistic approach to survival in which mental and physical resilience were intertwined. Winter also shaped social structures. Communities learned that collective action was essential for survival. Villagers shared firewood, rationed grain, and even rotated duties to ensure that elderly and sick members survived. Failure to cooperate could mean entire families perished. These winter-driven social bonds reinforced local governance, traditions, and community solidarity. Influencing medieval politics, trade, and culture more than scholars often acknowledge. Personal survival stories capture the human dimension of this struggle. In northern France, a diary recounts a woman walking miles through deep snow to fetch firewood, returning to find her home barely habitable and her children on the brink of starvation. In Sweden, a man recorded ice fishing for days with minimal clothing, risking frostbite to feed his family. These tales illustrate the raw courage, ingenuity, and desperation that defined medieval winters. Even the smallest innovations mattered. Villagers constructed windbreaks, insulated doors with straw, and layered bedding with hides and blankets. Stone ovens were designed to radiate heat longer, and hearth placement in homes was carefully calculated. Clothing evolved for maximum warmth and mobility, with mittens, hoods, and layered garments becoming standard. Every detail of daily life, from the design of boots to the timing of meals, was influenced by the struggle to survive. By the time spring arrived, the cost of winter was visible everywhere. Skeletons revealed chronic malnutrition, stunted growth, and frost-related injuries. Yet those who survived carried vital knowledge forward. Techniques in food storage, clothing, architecture, and community organization shaped generations, creating a legacy of resilience. Medieval people understood that survival was not a singular heroic act, it was a year-round strategy, a constant calculation of resources, risk, and ingenuity. In the end, medieval winters were far more than cold months, they were shaping forces of human innovation, culture, and community. They forged traditions, inspired folklore, and forced people to adapt in ways that seem almost unbelievable today. The survivors were not just lucky, they were clever, resourceful, and resilient. Every hearth lit, every root eaten, every shared blanket and loaf of bread was a tiny act of triumph against a relentless, unforgiving natural world. Winter was not just a season of cold and death, it was also a time when medieval culture, religion, and psychology intertwined in fascinating ways. Long nights and relentless frost shaped traditions, festivals, and rituals that were as much about survival as celebration. The medieval calendar was punctuated by events that offered both spiritual and practical respite from the harshest months. Yule and the Midwinter Festival were particularly significant in Northern Europe. Originally rooted in pagan traditions, these celebrations marked the return of the sun after the winter solstice. Families would light large hearth fires, burn Yule logs, and gather for communal feasts. While modern audiences might see these rituals as purely festive, they served crucial survival purposes. Fires provided warmth, communal meals ensured resource sharing, and storytelling kept spirits high during months when despair could easily take hold. Candlemas, celebrated on February 2nd, held similar significance. Villagers would light candles, a symbol of hope and light in the darkest part of the year, and gather to perform rituals that were believed to protect crops, livestock, and human health. Such observances were more than superstition, they were a form of psychological preparation. In a world where a snowstorm could obliterate food stores, maintaining hope was itself a life-saving strategy. The psychological impact of winter on medieval people cannot be overstated. Extended periods of cold, hunger, and isolation created chronic anxiety and depression, conditions not recognized at the time but visible in historical records. Diaries, letters, and chronicles often describe despairing villagers, families weakened by famine, and widespread fear of the coming cold months. Yet, alongside this despair, communities developed coping mechanisms. Ritual, storytelling, and structured labor schedules created a sense of control and routine in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Architecture and shelter were key to survival, and medieval people displayed remarkable ingenuity. Peasant homes often used earth, sod, and timber for insulation. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed snow, and walls were thickened with clay or straw. Windows were minimal to reduce heat loss, and doorways often featured heavy curtains. Wealthier homes and castles employed tapestries, wooden shutters, and multiple hearths to retain warmth. Even small innovations, like insulating beds with straw, furs, or pine branches, could mean the difference between life and death. Clothing was similarly optimized. Layers of wool, linen, and fur were standard, often supplemented with straw or feathers for additional insulation. Mittens, hoods, and boots were carefully designed to trap heat while allowing movement. In some northern regions, people sewed pockets or pouches into garments to hold hot stones or herbs, providing localized warmth. Every stitch and layer was a calculated response to the environmental threat. Food and drink also reflected winter ingenuity. Thick pottages, boiled roots, and salted meats were supplemented with preserved fruits, fermented vegetables, and, when available, cheese and butter. Alcoholic beverages like beer and wine were staples, not only for nutrition but also for warmth and hydration when water sources were frozen or contaminated. Even humble grains were rationed meticulously. A loaf of bread might be divided into daily portions, with every crumb calculated to sustain life until spring. Superstition and religion played a subtle but critical role in survival. Medieval people often attributed extreme cold, illness, and crop failure to supernatural forces. Witches, frost demons, and evil spirits were believed to influence weather and health. Rituals, charms, and prayers were practical as well as spiritual, by organizing labor, sharing resources, and maintaining community cohesion under the guise of superstition. Villagers increased their odds of survival. Perhaps the most astonishing stories are personal accounts of near-death survival. In northern England, a chronicler describes a family trapped by snow for weeks, surviving on boiled bark and frozen roots while huddled together in a one-room home. In Scandinavia, ice fishers risked hypothermia and frostbite, sometimes lying on ice for hours to cut holes and secure fish to feed entire villages. These stories reveal both the severity of the environment and the extraordinary resilience of people who faced it. Winter, for medieval Europeans, was a teacher. It demanded preparation, ingenuity, cooperation, and endurance. It forged social bonds, influenced culture and religion, and shaped architecture, clothing, and food systems. Most importantly, it forced people to confront mortality daily, creating a worldview in which survival was never guaranteed, and every small act, lighting a fire, sharing a loaf of bread, layering furs, was a victory against an unforgiving natural world. By the end of February and into March, the first signs of thaw brought relief, celebration, and cautious optimism. Survivors had endured months of cold, hunger, and isolation. They carried scars and stories, but also knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Medieval winters were not merely historical curiosities, they were crucibles that shaped human resilience, creativity, and community in ways that resonate even today. Some medieval winters were so severe that they reshaped entire regions. One of the most infamous examples is the winter of 1709, often called the Great Frost of Europe. Temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Celsius -4 degrees Fahrenheit across France, Germany, and Italy. Rivers froze solid, and snow blanketed fields for weeks. Crops failed, livestock perished, and famine followed. Contemporary reports describe people boiling tree bark for sustenance, burning furniture to keep warm, and huddling in barely habitable shelters. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of Europeans died from starvation, exposure, and disease in just a few months. Even smaller-scale winters could be deadly. In northern England and Scotland, rivers froze for weeks at a time, cutting off villages from trade and food supplies. Diaries recount families subsisting on nothing but dried fish, roots, and tree bark for weeks. Ice storms destroyed roofs and barns, collapsing structures under the weight of snow. Communities often banded together, pooling resources and sharing warmth, but even collective effort could not prevent widespread mortality. Survival in extreme climates required innovation. In Scandinavia, people developed ice fishing techniques that allowed entire villages to secure protein for months. Holes were cut into thick ice, traps and nets set beneath the surface, and fish stored in snow pits to prevent spoilage. Clothing was layered meticulously. Wool, linen, fur, and feathers were combined, sometimes sewn into pockets or pouches to hold hot stones for localized warmth. Beds were layered with straw, furs, and pine branches, maximizing retained heat. Every detail of daily life was influenced by the cold. Architecture adapted to winter in remarkable ways. Alpine communities built homes partially buried into hillsides to conserve heat. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed snow, and communal ovens radiated warmth to adjacent rooms. Windows were small, doors insulated with straw or heavy cloth, and floors sometimes covered with straw or pine to reduce frost exposure. Even in castles, where wealth offered advantages, residents faced challenges. Stone walls absorbed cold, hearths provided limited heat, and servants often endured freezing corridors and drafty towers to maintain daily life. Trade and urban planning were also influenced by winter. Frozen rivers and blocked roads disrupted the supply of grain, salt, and firewood. Cities had to store reserves for months, and guilds often coordinated. Rationing. In Venice, rare freezes of the canals halted trade and forced merchants to improvise. Across Europe, winter dictated political decisions. Armies delayed campaigns, taxes in grain or firewood were carefully scheduled, and the success of towns often depended on foresight and preparation for months of isolation. Even religion and superstition were adapted to winter survival. People prayed to saints for protection against frost, plague, and famine. Charms, rituals, and protective rites served both spiritual and practical purposes, organizing labor, sharing resources, and enforcing community cohesion under the guise of superstition increased the likelihood of survival. Folklore, including stories of snow witches, frost giants, and winter spirits, reinforced lessons of caution, preparation, and respect for the season's dangers. Food preservation was critical. Beyond the standard salting, smoking, and drying, fermentation became a life-saving technique. Scandinavian communities relied on fermented fish, *surströmming*, while Germans preserved vegetables in brine or buried grains to prevent freezing. Wild plants were harvested and carefully prepared. Even moss and lichens were consumed when conventional food sources failed. Alcoholic beverages were also vital, providing calories, warmth, and safe hydration when water sources froze or were contaminated. Personal survival stories capture the extremity of these conditions. One chronicler from Germany describes a man walking 5 miles through deep snow to fetch grain for his starving village. In Sweden, ice fishers worked on frozen lakes for days with minimal clothing, risking frostbite and hypothermia to feed entire communities. In France, families huddled in a single-room cottage, sharing heat with livestock and subsisting on boiled roots and stale bread. These accounts demonstrate both the danger of medieval winters and the ingenuity required to endure them. Even mundane objects became life-saving tools. Iron pots were used to radiate heat in small rooms, beds were insulated with layers of straw and furs, and every scrap of clothing was repurposed to maintain warmth. Communities developed meticulous routines to reduce exposure. Chopping wood, fetching water, and tending livestock were scheduled to minimize time outdoors. Every action, every innovation, and every precaution was a calculated response to an environment that could be lethally unforgiving. Medieval winters were not simply seasons, they were forces that shaped architecture, culture, trade, medicine, and psychology. The survivors carried forward lessons in resourcefulness, cooperation, and adaptation. Every preserved root, every shared fire, every layer of wool was a victory against an environment that demanded constant vigilance. The cold forged communities, honed ingenuity, and created resilience that would define generations long after the snow melted. In essence, surviving a medieval winter was a full-time occupation, demanding planning, courage, and extraordinary ingenuity. And though most people did not survive every winter, those who did demonstrated the remarkable capacity of humans to endure, adapt, and even thrive in conditions that modern readers would find almost impossible. Some winters became legendary, etched into memory through the suffering they caused and the ingenuity they inspired. In Norway, chronicles describe a winter in the early 1500s where snow blanketed entire valleys for months. Villagers survived by eating fish preserved under ice, boiling moss into a tasteless but caloric mush, and relying on communal fires shared across homes. One account tells of a shepherd who, trapped on a mountainside, survived by using his own cloak as insulation, wrapping himself with snow as a barrier against the icy wind, and rationing dried fish for days until rescue. His story spread, becoming part cautionary tale, part inspiration. And a reminder of human endurance. In Scotland, harsh winters often cut off remote Highland villages from the rest of the country. Chroniclers described families walking for hours through thigh-deep snow to collect firewood or water, huddling together in single-room cottages with livestock, and relying on minimal food rations. One diary entry recounts a mother who survived by feeding her children first, eating only scraps herself. These tales were not anomalies, they were daily realities for much of medieval Europe, highlighting both the cruelty of winter and the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people. Winter also shaped folklore and literature. Tales of frost giants, snow witches, and enchanted forests were not simply entertainment, they were warnings. They taught lessons about respect for the environment, preparation, and survival. In Germany and Scandinavia, stories of Yule trolls or winter spirits conveyed the importance of rationing food, maintaining fires, and avoiding unnecessary exposure. In England, folklore about the bold frost served as a mental framework to understand and survive the long, punishing months. These myths reinforced communal knowledge, subtly encoding survival strategies in narrative form. Practical innovations emerged in response to these dangers. Communities designed double-walled homes, layered bedding, and underground storage pits. In Russia, villages insulated homes with moss and clay, created thick winter boots from layered hides, and developed ice harvesting techniques to preserve food. Alpine communities crafted roofs capable of withstanding heavy snow loads and devised communal ovens that warmed multiple rooms simultaneously. Even in urban centers, citizens coordinated rationing systems, stockpiled firewood, and adapted clothing to withstand extreme cold. Food innovations were critical. Medieval Europeans learned to ferment vegetables, smoke and salt meats, and store grains in insulated pits or barrels. Wild herbs, roots, and even bark became staples during famine winters. In Scandinavia, fish was preserved through drying, smoking, and fermentation, sometimes remaining edible for months under ice or snow. Honey, when available, provided both calories and medicinal benefits. Communities learned to combine available resources efficiently, transforming scarcity into survival. Medical adaptations also reflected the winter's demands. Frostbite treatments included warming limbs with heated stones, herbal poultices, and wrapping in furs. Respiratory illnesses were treated with herbal steam baths and spices like ginger or garlic. Even when remedies were symbolic or ritualistic, they served a purpose, maintaining morale, reducing fear, and reinforcing routines that increased survival odds. The psychological toll of winter shaped behavior and culture. Extended darkness, hunger, and isolation required community solidarity. Festivals like Candlemas, Yule, and St. Lucia Day were not merely celebrations, they reinforced cooperation, rationing, and shared responsibility. Storytelling, music, and ritualized tasks provided distraction from despair, while also encoding practical survival knowledge. Children learned early to contribute to firewood gathering, water collection, and food preparation, embedding life-saving skills into daily routines. Even small, mundane innovations mattered. Iron pots radiated heat when filled with hot coals. Doors and windows were insulated with straw or cloth. Beds were layered with straw, animal hides, and blankets to preserve warmth. Clothing was multi-layered and carefully maintained, with mittens, hoods, and boots designed for both mobility and insulation. Every object, action, and routine became a tool against the relentless cold. By the time spring arrived, survivors were both exhausted and triumphant. Families counted losses, of livestock, grain, and sometimes loved ones, but the knowledge and experience gained ensured better preparedness for future winters. Winter left visible and invisible scars, malnutrition, frostbite, psychological trauma, but also resilience, ingenuity, and community cohesion that endured for generations. Medieval winters, for all their brutality, shaped European culture, folklore, architecture, and technology. They forced humans to innovate in food preservation, clothing, shelter, and medicine. They demanded cooperation, reinforced social bonds, and created traditions that blended practicality with ritual. Most people did not survive every winter, but those who did passed on knowledge that made survival slightly more attainable for the next generation. In the end, winter was both enemy and teacher, shaping humanity in ways that resonate even in the modern world. Medieval winters did more than threaten survival, they reshaped trade, politics, and urban life. Rivers and roads froze, halting the movement of grain, firewood, and essential goods. Cities became dependent on carefully managed stockpiles, often rationed by guilds or municipal authorities. In Venice, the rare freezing of canals disrupted trade routes, threatening both commerce and nutrition. In northern Germany, frozen rivers delayed shipments of grain and salted fish, forcing towns to innovate storage solutions and rationing systems to prevent famine. Politics were equally influenced. Monarchs and local lords had to account for winter logistics when planning campaigns, collecting taxes, or enforcing laws. A harsh winter could decimate a peasant population, reducing labor for agriculture, weakening armies, and threatening the economic stability of entire regions. Decisions on food distribution, winter levies, and military campaigns were shaped as much by snow and frost as by diplomacy or strategy. In some cases, famine and cold directly sparked unrest. Desperate communities resisted taxation or rebelled against failed leadership, demonstrating how deeply winter intertwined with governance. Urban architecture evolved under the pressure of cold. Cities added insulated storage facilities, and homes were redesigned to reduce heat loss. Thick walls, small windows, and heavy doors became standard. Communal ovens and heating methods were optimized to distribute warmth efficiently. Even in castles, innovations like double hearths, tapestries for insulation, and careful firewood management became essential. Streets were designed to allow access during snowstorms, with drainage systems modified to handle ice melt and prevent flooding. Every architectural decision had winter survival in mind. Extreme famine events revealed the brutality of medieval winters. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 remains the most notorious. Relentless rain followed by snow destroyed crops across northern Europe. Starvation was rampant, people ate tree bark, boiled roots, and even resorted to cannibalism in isolated cases. Entire villages were abandoned, their skeletons later found with signs of malnutrition and disease. Similarly, during the Great Frost of 1709, France saw hundreds of thousands die from exposure, starvation, and disease, illustrating the lethal potential of winter even in regions with relative wealth and infrastructure. Every survival story highlights ingenuity and resilience. In Norway, a farmer trapped by blizzards survived by boiling snow for water, feeding his family fermented fish, and layering every piece of clothing and bedding available. In the Alps, villagers insulated homes with snow tunnels and layered straw, firs, and pine branches, creating microclimates that preserved life even in sub-zero temperatures. In England and Scotland, families huddled in single-room cottages with livestock, rationing minimal food stores while rotating warmth among children and elders. These acts were not heroic in a conventional sense. They were pragmatic, calculated, and often the only path between life and death. Winter also reshaped agriculture and food systems. Fields were chosen based on drainage and frost risk, grain was stored in pits insulated with straw and earth, and livestock was kept close to shelters for warmth. Brewing beer and fermenting vegetables were not merely culinary, they were essential survival strategies, providing calories, nutrients, and hydration. Even simple innovations like multi-layered boots, insulated beds, and shared hearths were life-saving adaptations repeated across centuries and regions. Social organization evolved around winter survival. Communities learned cooperation was essential. Sharing firewood, food, and shelter could mean the difference between life and death. Labor schedules were optimized to minimize exposure, and communal activities like ice fishing, firewood collection, and livestock care were often coordinated. Winter festivals, rituals, and religious observances reinforced cohesion, while stories, folklore, and superstition encoded practical lessons on survival. The cold demanded both physical and social ingenuity. By spring, survivors emerged exhausted but wiser. They bore physical scars, frostbite, malnutrition, stunted growth, and psychological ones, but also an unparalleled knowledge of how to endure, innovate, and adapt. Medieval winters, in all their brutality, were teachers. They shaped architecture, trade, politics, clothing, food, medicine, and even the moral and psychological frameworks of communities. Every hearth lit, every root cooked, every blanket layered was a triumph over one of the harshest natural forces humanity has faced. In the end, surviving a medieval winter was more than enduring cold, it was an exercise in ingenuity, resilience, and community. Most did not survive every winter, yet those who did passed down lessons that shaped generations, influencing the development of society, technology, and culture in ways often overlooked. The medieval winter was a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance and creativity. Its survivors were not merely lucky, they were masters of adaptation, capable of turning desperation into survival, and struggle into knowledge that would endure for centuries. The story of medieval winters is a story of humanity itself, fragile, ingenious, and relentless in the face of adversity. Each snowstorm, each frozen river, each starving village reminds us that survival is never guaranteed, but with ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience, even the harshest season can be endured.